you with us for what we hope will be the first of a series of lectures sponsored by Westmont in conservation policy and conservation biology. And we're just delighted to have with us this evening Glenn Olson, who has spent his really entire adult life in conservation issues and bird conservation. He's currently the Donald O'Brien Chair of Bird Conservation for the National Audubon Society. For those of you who may not know, the Audubon Society itself is a national and international leader in conservation policy issues. And I'm reflecting my own personal point of view here, but I think it is really an exemplar of the way it blends rigorous scientific research that isn't distorted for one end or another, with really imaginative and socially coherent proposals for solving real world issues in bird conservation of both of species and their habitats. So Glenn is a native of California. His daughter Caitlin is actually a graduate of the Westmont's biology program in 2004. He was a leader in the restoration and recovery project for the California Condor. He currently oversees projects involving the conservation of over 800 bird species along with their habitats. He was the recipient of, in 2002, of Audubon's Charles Callison Award for his recognition in his work in conservation. And tonight he's going to address us, I think, on a blending of describing some conservation challenges and promises, along with the thrill of investing a life in those projects. So thank you very much, Glenn, for being with us.
Thank you, Jeff. We actually started talking about this a couple years ago. We had a reception at the Natural History Museum with honoring Pedro Nava, your local assemblyman, who had sponsored our legislation to ban lead in ammunition for the California condor. And it was a really long shot piece of legislation. We actually raised $25,000 to hire a public relations firm. This is how things get done in Sacramento. And the public relations firm was very close to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And we had assumed all along that the Republicans were going to oppose our legislation. They had actually written a letter, and the unanimous Senate and Assembly Republicans had requested that the Fish and Game Commissioner, who was trying to ban lead in ammunition in the Condor Range, be removed. And the governor removed him from the Fish and Game Commission. And so we thought, oh, there's no way he's going to sign our legislation. But we ended up, the governor ended up signing the legislation. I'll show you some pictures of condors and kind of the victory celebration. But Jeff came to our reception at the Natural History Museum, and I had not only my daughter Caitlin, but my son Kyle, who had been in school here and had wonderful experiences. And we started planting the seed for how I could come at some point and talk about conservation and stewardship of God's creation and the kinds of things that that are exemplified here just by the stewardship of this campus over so many years. And first of all, my wife and I both went to UC Santa Barbara, and it's so amazing to come down the Gaviota Coast and come out through the tunnel. Well, it's now a one-way tunnel going the other way, but it used to be a two-way tunnel in 1968. And to see the Gaviota Coast is still just like it was when we went to college. There aren't many places in California that have been so well taken care of. And this community, I remember coming to our first, our son was a freshman in probably 1999 or 2000 here, and meeting President Winter and his wife in this building. And his wife Helene and I started saying, this is really an extraordinary campus. There's coastal sage scrub, there's lots of live oak trees. You guys have done an incredible job. And she spiraled right up on that. Well, we ought to be doing more. And it's just taken us a while to kind of figure out what that more could be. So it's really exciting for me to be here tonight. And I thought I'd start out with kind of a little background. And this is a new book that was just written in 2009. It's about Teddy Roosevelt. He was a president 100 years ago right now of the United States. And the book's called The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. And it starts out with a wonderful story. 3 Republican presidents had been assassinated in the late 1800s. In fact, McKinley had just been assassinated when Roosevelt came in as he was the vice president. And so we'd lost 3 Republican presidents. They're having a cabinet meeting. President Roosevelt is not in the room. Everybody's on the edge of his seat. This is how the book starts. The first paragraphs. You know, is everything okay? Is the president alive? And Roosevelt comes running in. Everybody's still on the edge of their seats wondering what's going on. He goes, "It's only February and I've just seen my first chestnut-backed warbler on the White House grounds. Isn't that exciting?" And then you go to the end of the book, and they have the maps of what he did in his presidency and the list of the national wildlife refuges and the national forest system and that he established and created. He was here and I was reading this account of Santa Barbara today at the hotel we were in. In 1903, he did a whistle-stop tour through, and the woman who, Annie Hollister, didn't want to go see him because her brother or son had been killed in the charge up the Rough Riders Hill in Cuba, the war that when we were fighting the Spanish-American War that he had led, and he went up to her house and reconciled and said what a brave soldier her son had been. But in that time, he also established what was then called the Santa Barbara National Forest, and it later became the Los Padres National Forest. And it was an amazing time, and what a visionary leader we had. And what Audubon is looking for in the 21st century is big vision, bird conservation, national, international, landscape level, flyway wide conservation initiatives. And this is Teddy Roosevelt on Pelican Island in 2003. And the guy on the left is Frank Chapman, who was the founder of Audubon. Roosevelt was actually one of our founders as well. And then the guy in the middle was the head of the Biological Survey. And what they did was they were trying to protect these bird nesting islands from the millinery trade. Women were using feathers in their hats, and for an ounce of egret feathers, white egret feathers, snowy or American egrets, was worth more than an ounce of gold. And it took 4 birds to make an ounce of feathers. So you could make more money killing birds than you could robbing banks or if you were a gold miner. It was a very lucrative thing. And Roosevelt and the early Audubon Society combined to try and protect the areas along the Gulf Coast, along the Florida coast, and ultimately across the whole country. 55 units of the National Wildlife Refuge System were created during this time. And this is the story of this book. At the end of Roosevelt's tenure, 239 million acres of America was set aside from 1903 to 1909. The guy made a difference. The National Forest System was created. National parks like Grand Canyon, Crater Lake, Olympic National Park were established. And 55 units of the National Wildlife Refuge System. The first wildlife refuge system in the world were created. And he did it by executive order using the Antiquities Act because Congress didn't want to go along and with him and do it. And so they wouldn't appropriate money. And so the early Audubon Society, which is also 100 years old, it's actually 105 years old, we then supplied the wardens for each of these refuges around the country. And if you read the history of like Malheur in Oregon or Klamath Basin on the Oregon-California border, huge national wildlife refuges, all of the waterfowl of the Pacific Flyway funnel through an area of about 6 miles through the Klamath Basin, and hundreds of thousands of acres set aside by Teddy Roosevelt. And Audubon then, in the 1906, 7, 8, up until the 1920s, provided the wardens there. And we actually arrested the mayor, our warden arrested the mayor of Newell, the little town up there, who was making $25,000 a year sending birds for market hunting, in this case not for women's hats, but for market hunting in San Francisco markets. You could make a lot of money doing things that killed wildlife before we had any laws to protect wildlife. And Roosevelt was the early leader in this, and Audubon was sort of his partner in making that happen. So we're going to flash forward to kind of a survey of some of the contemporary projects that we've been working on. And kind of my message to you all, as many of you are students, is to be encouraged and to be inspired. And what look like overwhelming challenges when you start out, you just got to take one step at a time. And before you know it, you can make a huge difference. And as Jeff and I were talking about this talk, he said, well, do you want to talk about, protecting God's creation and bringing your faith into what you're doing and why you do it? And I really do want to do that. And I want to say, and I don't usually do this. I work for the Audubon Society. I've run the California program. I was in charge of the National Field Program. And why you do things isn't usually what you talk about when you're meeting with other audiences. But I like to think that the first rule of leadership, and this is something our pastor in Sacramento at our church taught me years ago, is to keep hope alive. And I think one of the things we can do as Christian leaders caring about the environment is how can we keep hope alive, and where do we get that hope? And the fact that God's creation is such an extraordinary thing, and the more time you spend in natural sciences, as we did today with many of the students that are here in the ecology class, being outside learning about nature and the rules of nature, the laws of nature that God has put in place, it just makes you more appreciate God and the glory that He has. So it's been a really fun adventure and a privilege for me to be able to do this. So with that, let me just jump in and start sharing a couple of our stories around the country, mostly in California, where I've been located for the last few years. This is the South Fork of the Kern River, and it's the best riparian habitat. Riparian habitats are the ones along streams, willows and cottonwoods generally, and it's a really diverse community. Lots of birds use that. And this one at places is a mile wide. It's like the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers used to be in the Central Valley, but they got levied to protect for flood control. And now if you have a 100-yard wide riparian strip of vegetation on each side, it'd be great. This is the best we have left in California and the best in the southwest United States. It's 15 miles long. If I can just slide over here to say that it goes from Lake Isabella above Bakersfield, and then here it turns north and it goes into the southern Sierra Nevadas, and this is the Domeland Wilderness and goes up to the Golden Trout Wilderness, and it's all a wild and scenic river on the public lands. So we've been able to protect the entire watershed, and now we're trying to protect the areas that are along from the Lake Isabella on up, and it's about a 15-mile long corridor. All the green areas have been acquired. The red area, the Alexander Ranch, was acquired 2 years ago. The Sprague properties, 1,700 acres, we acquired. Our partners are the Department of Fish and Game. We usually buy the land and we keep the core areas and give the outside properties to Fish and Game or BLM. And it's been an extraordinary project. We now have just the Onyx Ranch, which is a 60,000 acre ranch, is now in play. And we don't need the whole ranch, but we do want to get the part in purple there. And then we'll have only left to do the Sprague Ranch. And it's been a 25-year effort. And people wouldn't have thought we could do it at the beginning, but if you stay with it, you really can make extraordinary progress. And what's so cool about this area is it is a convergence of 4 different ecosystems. From the south, this is a Joshua tree, so you've got the Mojave Desert influence coming in. From the north, you've got the Sierra Nevadas coming down from the Domeland Wilderness. So at times in this valley floor, you'll get black bear walking through the riparian forest, which doesn't happen in many other places in California. And then you've got the Great Valley riparian systems from the Central Valley of California. And actually, the last would be the Great Basin ecosystem. If you just follow the highway up past where the river turns into the mountains, you go right over Walker Pass into the Great Basin ecosystem. So 4 different ecosystems coming together. And what you learn, kind of what I've learned in my career that I didn't know at the front end, I thought, oh, we protect an area and it's protected. That's all there is to it. And actually what you learn is that you got to continue to manage it. You learn adaptive management. You sort of try different things when you restore habitats, figure out what works and what doesn't work, and you keep going along until you learn what's happening. Well, we protected the ecosystem, but the willow flycatcher, which is an endangered species, still wasn't breeding. Only 20% of them were successfully fledging their young, and it turned out they were being parasitized by cowbirds, another native species, but one that's in much more abundance now because of huge cattle ranches and feedlots where they can congregate by the hundreds of thousands. And they can come in and they lay their eggs in the nests of native species, and they hatch earlier, they're bigger birds, and they push the native babies out of the nest. And so the willow flycatchers end up raising the babies of the cowbirds. And we started a cowbird trapping program. We were able to now turn it around so that rather than 20% fledging, we've got an 80% fledging success for the willow flycatchers. And another endangered species that's an obligate in riparian systems is a yellow-billed cuckoo. We probably have less than 200 pairs of yellow-billed cuckoos. Really amazing birds. They live in the tropics for 10 months of the year. They come up only for 2 months. They lay their eggs. They hatch their babies. They fly back to South America. And then the mountain quail is another indicator species of that ecosystem. Now, if you follow the Walker Pass over to the east and you go up through the Inyo Basin past Bishop, you get to an area known as Mono Lake, and it's kind of near the eastern Sierra, eastern edge of Yosemite National Park. And so this is a photograph that's close to, in Yosemite Park, probably on Mount Dana, and looking down at Mono Lake. And the big island in the middle is Nedjed Island, and then the one on to the left, the big island is Paho Island, the one to the left is Nedjed Island. Those are the two biggest nesting colonies of California gulls in the state of California. And it's also an important area for, these are the California gulls, but it's an important migratory stopover for other birds, Wilson's phalaropes and several species of grebes. When I came to work for Audubon in the late 1970s, this lake was being drained slowly by the Department of Water and Power in the city of Los Angeles. And we went down, I was 28 years old, I'm now 59, so 31 years ago, met with Dwayne Georgeson, this engineer who was in charge of the Department of Water and Power's projects in both Inyo, Owens Valley and in Mono Lake, and he said to me, it's a good thing you're young because you're going to be fighting us for the rest of your life. We're not giving up the water. And 4 years later, well, 2 years later, we sued in 1980. And, you know, it was the Audubon Society going up against the city of Los Angeles. Who's going to win that fight? But 4 years later, we won at the Supreme Court in 1984. And then it took about another 10 years to adjudicate through the State Water Resources Control Board how they're going to figure out who gets how much water. How much do the wildlife get? How much do the fish get in Levining Creek and Rush Creek and Walker, the four streams at Mill Creek that fed into it? And then how much can continue to going south? And it's, I'll tell you, the City of Los Angeles, Department of Water and Power loves being a good steward now of this resource. They're still getting some water for their city, but they're also, a lot more of their water now is coming from conservation. They've gotten, because they've had to get much better about conservation, they've basically found 300,000 acre feet of water, additional water supplies, through just better conservation of their resources. These are the tufa formations from the fresh water coming out and the minerals that are found. There's no fish, of course. It's brine fries and brine shrimp, and that makes it such an important stopover because there's no fish in there eating all the invertebrates, so the birds get all the food out of that. So more recently, what's been exciting to see is the City of Los Angeles restoring the Owens River and becoming a leader in recreating. They're still taking the water out when it gets down at the end of the Owens River before it goes into the Owens Lake, but they recreated a riparian corridor of over 40 miles through the Owens Valley. And one of my conservation heroes is the man on the left, Mike Prather. He's a high school biology teacher in Inyo County, and he's there with Mayor Antonio Villagrosa, the mayor of the City of Los Angeles, when they restored the river. And they're not done yet. They don't know this yet, but they need to also restore Owens Lake, which is another lake. And the reason they're going to, that was pumped dry in order to provide water for the City of Los Angeles, but it's a very important bird area. And it's, what's happening now is because of the dust that's caused by the lake being dry, and it's an alkali saline lake bed, and when the wind comes up, the dust particles are a real public health problem. It's one of the worst air quality basins in the country in terms of air quality. So they're now sprinkling the Owens Lake bed with water, restoring some of the wetlands, and it's become an extraordinarily valuable habitat for shorebirds. And in fact, if you know, here in Santa Barbara at Coal Oil Point, out at the edge of Devereaux Slough, we have a nesting colony of snowy plovers that nest on the beach there. There's maybe 50 to 100 pairs of snowy plovers. on this interior site, we have 1,100 pairs of snowy plovers, so it's a really valuable place. And again, I feel like we're beginning to work well with the City of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power on making that project happen. This is let me just come back over here. So I was just telling you about the Kern River Preserve, the riparian grove, and how it goes up into the high Sierras. The dark green are wilderness areas, the light green are national forest public lands. And then we talked about Mono Lake, which is up here. And now I want to talk a little about how we connected the southern Sierra Nevada with the Coast Range. And you guys are out here. I think this is Point Conception, and so the Santa Barbara area is right here. And you see you've got an awful lot of public land. This is mostly the Los Padres National Forest here. And a couple of years ago, well, we've been working on the California condor since the 1940s, Audubon has, and we've seen it go down and down in terms of population and to a world population of under 26 birds in the mid-1980s. And we then supported bringing the birds into captivity with the Los Angeles and San Diego zoos. And, but the heart of the condor's range has always been the Tejon Ranch. The condors are scavengers. They eat dead cattle and stillborn calves, as well as dead deer and wild pigs. And the Tejon Ranch is 280,000 acres, has been the key to the kind of the kernel of the nut. And 2 years ago, we were able to assemble a group of conservationists, including NRDC, the Sierra Club, and a couple of other organizations. But spearheaded by Audubon, we were able to get the Tejon Ranch to agree to protect 90% of the ranch in exchange for being able to develop 10% of the ranch. And part of that 10% is already being developed. If you go from the base of the Grapevine in the southern San Joaquin Valley, south of Bakersfield, there's a big IKEA workshop. There's the world's largest Starbucks. It's got 10 bathrooms. It's a drive-through. That's already been developed. And then they're going to develop a new city on the Antelope Valley side, Centennial. And what we said was, as environmental groups, we would support we would not oppose their development. We wouldn't support it, but we thought that having the fact that they had protected 90% of the ranch, it would build a lot of momentum towards getting their approval of the new developments they're proposing in the Antelope Valley. And in exchange, they also agreed to do a real estate transfer tax that every time a new house in this new town that hasn't been built yet trades hands, goes to a new owner, there would be a transfer tax, and it would provide between $7 and $15 million a year for the stewardship of the ranch. And it would include even new condor biologists that could help us work on the California condor. So that, I wanted to say that up front and just show you a few pictures. It gets up to over 7,000 feet. It's 40 miles north to south, largest ranch in California. And it's now under a conservation agreement to be protected. It's got, just like California 100 years ago, tule elk, pronghorn antelope, still found on the ranch. And this was the conservation, the day we signed the conservation agreement, the governor came down, and this was done without public funds. Basically the agreement to protect the ranch, they were going to do it privately. Now there are about 40,000 acres we would like to have additional be put in as state parks, and that could be used, they could use bond act funding, but I think part of the reason the governor was so excited about it. And the man on his right is Graham Chisholm, who was my deputy director for Audubon, California, and now is the state director. And so that was a big milestone for the California condor. The other thing, as I was mentioning in my, when Jeff introduced me, was getting lead banned. That we've restored the California condor. It was down to 22 birds. They're now back in the wild. There's 170 birds flying free in 3 separate populations in California, the Grand Canyon, and the San Pedro Martir in northern Baja California, all historic nesting locations. But they won't be able to be a self-sustaining population until they can breed okay in the wild. Right now, they're putting out clean food sources, stillborn calves and other kinds of animals, dead animals, as carcasses for them to feed on, because there's still a lot of lead in the environment. The passage of that legislation banning lead in ammunition in the Condor's range will eventually clean up, we hope, so that the Condor's lead sources. So right now, what was happening is birds would come in with lead poisoning, and you could tell they were sick. We'd recapture them. They had almost lethal levels of lead in their blood. So we'd do a chelation therapy where we'd transfer all their blood into a machine, take out the lead, and then put the blood back in. It was about a $5,000 transformation that had to occur with these sick birds, and there's just no way they could become a self-sustaining population with that problem. This is kind of a cool picture. This is from August last year, and this is about 27 condors, more than we had in the world population when we started working on this. And this is up in the Tehachapi Mountains on a ranch called the San Mitio Ranch, next to the Tajon Ranch. And the bird there, they all have patagial wing markers and tags. AC8 was one of the original adult condors that were brought in 20 years ago in the mid-1980s, and it was released back with the young birds in order to help provide a culturization to show the young birds how they're supposed to behave as wild birds, where they're supposed to go at certain times of the year. And that's pretty cool. And then one of the neater things that's happened is we've restored the condors up north into the Central Coast Range, and so they're nesting in a large cavity here in a redwood tree in the Big Sur wilderness areas. And this was when we signed our legislation. We had the governor signed our legislation. He told me that, "Oh, I really like that bird. It's a big ugly bird, but I really like those condors. I wanted a statue in my office, but it has a 10-foot wingspan. I couldn't fit it." So, and I said, "Well, you know, Governor, we didn't know you were going to sign our legislation." He said, "Oh no, on the California quarter, I put the condor. There's Yosemite Valley, John Muir, and the condor. I put that condor on the back. I like these condors." So, one of the cool things is now on the Big Sur coastline, occasionally a California gray whale will wash up, and then you'll get the California condors. Probably hasn't happened for 100 years, coming down and feeding on the carcasses of a dead whale. So switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about the joint ventures across the country. These are wetland and waterfowl joint ventures that were actually started about 20 years ago, and the Central Valley joint venture is one of the most important ones. And what happens is you've got about 100 million waterfowl that are called the continental waterfowl population that nests mainly in the prairie pothole regions, Canada, Alaska, and even into Wrangel Island in Russia. And of that 100 million waterfowl, about 10 million come down the Pacific Flyway, which is our flyway. 60% of those waterfowl winter in California's Central Valley. So that's like 6 million birds. And we're going from 35 million people to 50 million people. We're going to have a lot of people living in our state. We got to get these areas protected, and we got to get the water secured for these areas while we can, before there's too many people and there's not enough habitat and water left for these birds. And so these are some of the projects that we've been doing in the Sacramento Valley. The area here is our Paul Wattis Waterfowl Sanctuary. It's 850 acres. These are state wildlife management areas. The light green are private easement areas through the Wetland Reserve Program. And over the last 20 years, we've gotten 100 landowners, excuse me for showing that, 100 landowners representing 100,000 acres to sign up for Wetland Reserve Program. So they permanently protected their habitat through previous bond acts. Since 2000, we've gotten over $10 billion that have gone into parks and wildlife habitat, a lot of that going into the Central Valley of California. And so this is our Paul Wattis Sanctuary when we started it a number of years ago. It was an old rice field. Rice fields were wetlands. They were drained to become rice fields in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in California. And we flew up. One of my first big donors was Joe Long of Long's Drug Stores, and he gave me $1 million for this project. He loved waterfowl habitat. And I was telling him about how these guys were building these nesting islands. The people that did this had built golf courses, and they made these nesting islands look like putting greens rather than just squaring them off. And he said, "Well, do you have to get home?" right away. And I go, well, why? You know, it was about 5 o'clock. I was at Long Drug Store's headquarters in Walnut Creek, and he said, I just chartered a helicopter. We're flying up there right now. I want to go see this place. So we flew up there, and this picture was taken of that. And then what's fun about Wetlands is this is the first year, the Paul Wattis Waterfowl Sanctuary, and then now about 15 years later, the trees are 30 or 40 feet tall, and we winter over 500,000 waterfowl. Of that 6 million waterfowl that winter in the Central Valley, this little 850 acres can provide habitat for that many birds. And it's almost instant gratification in terms of habitat restoration, that you can create that kind of habitat so quickly and the birds will start using it so quickly. And part of the funding has come from duck hunters, and they have to pay for duck stamps. This is an old duck stamp, and it's now up to $15 for your, this is 1983. But they buy areas like the Gray Lodge State Wildlife Management Area, which is right next door to where our Wattis Sanctuary is. So we've sort of extended the habitat of some state and federal wildlife areas. And this is the closed zone at Gray Lodge. It's an 8,000 acre reserve. And the birds sit in the sanctuary all day and then fly out and feed in the rice fields, which are flooded at night. And we have a partnership with the rice industry where they can no longer burn their rice because of air quality concerns. And so what they do is flood up their habitat and decompose their straw by flooding it. And then the birds just fly out into the rice fields, and there's a like waste grain of 10 to 20% of the rice is left there. And so it's a really good partnership with the rice industry. Pintail ducks, beautiful ducks. And this is, like I mentioned, up to 500,000 acres of rice, including about 300,000 acres that are flooded, and the Wetlands Reserve Program over 100,000 acres. And this is an area just north of Sacramento. So this is Davis, California. Sacramento would be right here. And this is an area of rice growing region, and we've created out of this old drain a 15-mile long corridor. We're going to connect it to Colusa National Wildlife Refuge and then the Yolo Bypass and the Conway Ranch down at the southern end. And these areas are now in permanent easements. And this is called the Roosevelt Ranch. And a couple of our Audubon board members did this project just in the last couple years. And this is what the Roosevelt Ranch looks like now. It's just 260,000 trees, willows and cottonwoods were planted on it. They haven't gotten up very tall yet, but the natural wetlands are coming in, tules and cattails and sedges, and there's a flock of white pelicans on the right side using it. And then the shorebirds use these areas. So you've got small little dowitchers and then white-faced ibis, the larger birds that come in to these areas as well. And then lots and lots of geese. White-fronted geese, these are snow geese. These are more snow geese. And if you haven't been to the Central Valley in the wintertime, areas like these national wildlife refuges, you go in there at nighttime when the birds are flying out about sunset. It's like going to the Serengeti Plain in Africa. It's spectacular. You really should do it. I mean, it's magical. So then if we move to the west side of the valley, so that's Winters, and if you were on the other side of the screen, about 10 miles is Davis, so we're into the interior coast range. We had an opportunity to buy the Bobcat Ranch, which is 7,000 acres, and it's a blue oak woodland. It's got 3 miles of frontage on Puta Creek, Lake Berryessa here. Yolo Land and Cattle is another 8,000 acres in an easement program. We haven't protected these areas. We are putting an easement on the Cowell Ranch. The same person that bought that Roosevelt Ranch bought the Cowell Ranch, and now we're putting an easement on that property. And this is what that habitat looks like. It's the edge of the Central Valley on the west side, the interior coast range, and it's a blue oak woodland. And blue oak woodlands are only found, they're indigenous to California. And all the suites of species, the Lewis woodpeckers, and lots of the birds that are found only in that habitat. And what's cool about this, blue oak woodlands on the Sierra side, we have more snowpack, we have more rainfall on the Sierra side, so there's a lot more development. Whereas there's not, on the interior coast range, it's almost like a desert. There's maybe 6 to 10 inches of rainfall. And so the habitat's similar, except it doesn't have water, and so it hasn't been developed. And what we've done there is restore native grasses. And this is an 800 acre, on the Bobcat Ranch, first year of seeding and drilling native grasses into the area, second year. And here they can get up to, almost up to your shoulders in the third year, these native grass ecosystems. So another thing I'd like to just talk about is the State of the Birds report. And this was done for the first time in 2009. And the Secretary of Interior, Ken Salazar, in the Obama administration, led the effort to get this done. And this was at the National Press Club last March. And it's the first comprehensive analysis on the state of America's birds that has ever been done. And what you find is some species, like wetland species, where we're doing a lot of cooperative, coordinated, focused effort to conserve habitats and work on those species, are doing well. Other systems aren't doing well. And these are the organizations that cooperated. In addition to Audubon and the federal government, we had the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, Nature Conservancy, and many other groups. And kind of what the report states right off the bat is we've got 800 different species of birds. We are richly blessed in America with birds, of which 300 or so winter south of the border. So if you're going to protect 800 species of birds, you better make sure that those 300 have their essential habitats in wintering grounds and breeding grounds and migratory stopovers protected as well. And I won't go through all of it, but each of the various ecosystems, northern forests, arid lands, shrublands, grasslands, we did an analysis. And really the only one that was doing well was wetlands and waterfowl. And oceanic birds are one of the species of special concern. And I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about oceanic birds because this is something you all can help me with here in Santa Barbara. 18 out of 22 species of albatross in the world are threatened or endangered. And mostly it's a factor of bycatch issues. Countries do longline fisheries and they don't try and catch albatross, but they get tangled up in their fishing lines trying to get the bait that the fishermen are using to catch fish. And so it's a bad thing for the fishermen. And so the short-tailed albatross, which occurs off the California coast, was down to 100 birds in the entire world. 7-foot wingspan, magnificent, charismatic bird. And the Packard Foundation, David and Lucille Packard Foundation, this is David Packard of Hewlett Packard, started funding mitigation measures. They put streamers on these longline fisheries up in Alaska. And the fishermen didn't mind doing it because they found out that their birds weren't getting caught up in their lines and they didn't have to untangle the birds. And so now, this has just been going on a couple years, and now we've gone in short-tailed albatross from 100 to 1,700 in the world population. So they're really coming back. And they don't start breeding. These are long-lived birds that live 30 or 40 years. They don't start breeding until they're 8 or 9 years old. So that's an amazing recovery. And we've got the Laysan albatross, the black-footed albatross, and we've now got legislation. In the last day George Bush was in office, he signed a treaty protecting the albatross and petrels, all the shore seabirds. And it was his wife, Laura Bush, who really cared about him, and Hank and Wendy Paulson. Hank was Secretary of Treasury, had been head of Goldman Sachs, and his wife Wendy is a big bird watcher and really into conservation. And she worked with Laura to get George to sign this, and now we're trying to get the US Senate to ratify it. And in addition to ratifying the treaty, we have to have enabling legislation for how we're going to manage the fisheries out for the waters of the US, out 200 miles. And it turns out that your Congresswoman, Lois Capps, recently had a student intern who was a Sea Grant intern who really cared about marine and seabird conservation. And so we met with her recently, and she said she was interested in sponsoring our legislation. So I'm not sure if many of you are registered to vote in Santa Barbara County, but if you are, Lois Capps should be encouraged to support this legislation. Because what will happen, the big vision of this is that we're already solving the problem in California and Alaska, which is where we have albatross and seabirds, because they're doing these mitigation measures on their own. But if we get this done in California and through the United States, then we can go to the Japanese fishing fleets and the Asian fishing fleets, and most of the albatross are southern hemisphere birds, and we can go to the South American fishing fleets and put pressure on them and tell them it's a win-win situation. Your fishermen won't have to be untangling these birds, and we don't have to have these birds threatened with extinction. So those are wonderful kinds of solutions. So that was the 2009 State of the Birds report. And this year we're working on one that'll be coming out this spring with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Interior. And we're going to focus on climate change and the impacts climate change could have on populations of birds in the United States and throughout the Western Hemisphere. One of the other neat programs that Audubon has been, since July, I've taken this new position, this is a Donal O'Brien Chair in Bird Conservation. It's a national position, so I'm not just working in California. And what we've been doing is identifying the most important bird areas across the United States. And the ones in green there's about 3,000 IBAs, we call them important bird areas, and about 380 of those are globally important IBAs. And those are the ones we want to focus on having the greatest protection of, if we can. And so what we've done in California, we've identified 145 of these IBAs. We've taken the wind energy resource areas of the California Energy Commission, because we support using less greenhouse gases, and we support wind energy and renewable energy portfolios from solar energy, but we don't want to do it in areas where the birds are, our most important bird areas. And so we're looking at Southern California, so the yellow area, this is Los Angeles. These are all the wind energy, and in red, the solar energy projects proposed that would help President Obama meet his goal of 30% renewable energy. And last night on the State of the Union address, he said, we're going to create more jobs in clean energy. We support that. That'll help us use less, have less greenhouse gases, and it'll hopefully keep the temperature and sea level rises at a minimum. But we don't want to do it in our important bird areas. And the dark green sites are the important bird areas that we care about. The light green are the Nature Conservancy's biodiversity portfolio sites. And if you look out in the eastern part of the desert, out in these areas, you can see that it's not overlapping with any of the green areas. So we say go to it. More wind power, more solar power out there. If you're going to go right here, this is the Owens Ranch. This is the area we just got acquired for the California Condor. We're going to fight you if you go there. But the best part of it is we're giving you the information up front so you can site your power plants in places where it will avoid these kinds of problems. So it's really a useful thing for an enlightened developer to not have to have years and years of fighting. And then what we've done here is we've projected how global climate change will happen over the next 80 years. And this is just a hypothesis, but it's an informed hypothesis. It's based on 40 years of climate data and 40 years of bird counts from the Christmas bird counts, how the birds are already trending. And it's not uniform. Birds aren't just moving north, and they're not just moving to higher altitudes. There's areas where we will have 100% of the species will be found in the year 2100 in the dark green, these sites, like the Owens Ranch, and there's areas that are light green and beige out here in the southern desert along the Colorado River where we're probably going to lose a lot of species. So again, we would tend to put those power plants out in the areas where we would not have as many birds in the 22nd century. And then you can use these IBAs. This is a long-billed curlew, all the important bird areas. And we've done this. We are the BirdLife partner for the United States, but every country in the Western Hemisphere has a BirdLife partner that's identifying their most important bird areas. So then you can kind of follow the birds along their entire journey, or the sandhill cranes, and follow them all the way down into Mexico, the areas they use, and on up into Alaska where they breed. And then we've used, this is, as I was telling the ecology class today, kind of using GIS and conservation planning, the Tongass National Forest, another forest that was created by President Roosevelt. It's the world's largest temperate rainforest, and it's a national forest that belongs to all of us. And we are identifying those areas that are most important in the Tongass National Forest for protection of watershed, for salmon and steelhead resources, for bald eagles, and brown bear, Alaska brown bears, those kinds of things. And then we've also done this. This is an area on the North Slope of Alaska, and it's part of the National Petroleum Reserve. It's always been a set aside for development, for oil development in the future. But we've identified the areas offshore on the Chukchi and Bering Sea that are most important, in this case, for the yellow-billed loon. And we've done that for all sorts of different species. I've just given you a couple of different examples here. But we've identified all the polar bear denning areas. And then we gave that information to ConocoPhillips, who's the oil company that's going to be developing that. They've digitized our maps, put them in, and are trying to do that in the most sensitive way in developing those areas. So these are recoveries from Techesapeake Lake on the North Slope of Alaska, and you can see these birds winter throughout the Western Hemisphere, as well as the upper left is Russia. So birds from this North Slope of Alaska use areas all over the United States and Western Hemisphere, including the white-fronted geese, which is a big part of our Central Valley population in the wintertime. And then another species here is the king eider, and the area is now being proposed for development on the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Seas on the North Slope of Alaska. And we're just providing the information to say, let's make sure we're taking care of the king eiders. This is where they nest. This is that species of bird. So I'm going to close out with a couple pictures of people, because what I've done, and if you're getting into conservation, you got to get along with people, and you got to find people that support you, and you got to build a constituency of people that care about the environment. And this group of individuals, the one on the right was chairman of Stanford University and chairman of the Irvine Foundation. The second one from the right is David Packard of Hewlett-Packard. Sherman Chickering and Gregory did the first Audubon camp up in the High Sierras. The guy in the middle, the tall gentleman, is Ike Livermore. He was Secretary of Resources in the Reagan administration. He created our state wild, he's known as the father of the Wild and Scenic River System. And then Donal O'Brien on the left side, who was the chairman of Audubon for 15 years. And then here's a picture with Donal and I just this year. And my chair was named after Donal. He's a great guy. We raised $5 million to create this chair that I'm in. And he was the personal family attorney for the older Rockefellers, and a wonderful, wonderful, passionate bird conservation leader. So part of the message is there's lots of hope out there. We want to keep hope alive as leaders in the environmental movement, and then to get along with people and find ways for people to be inspired by nature. And this is not a hard place. I was saying this to Jeff's class today. I mean, you look up in the mountains, you look out at the Channel Islands. This is an inspiring place, and you should be able to take from what you have from the Westmont experience and go out there and change the world. And I guarantee you that some of you folks are going to change the world, and that's going to be a great thing. So, thank you.